Welcome to the Modern Husbands podcast, where Dr. Ross, Christian, and Brian host national experts who share ideas to manage money and the home as teammates. Today's guest is Jason Vitug, who is a best-selling author and inspirational speaker who talks about personal finance and well-being. His most recent book is Happy Money, Happy Life. Happy Money, Happy Life is an exciting and practical discussion at the intersection over overall well-being and our money. Today, we explore the interconnectedness of money and our overall well-being. Enjoy the show. Jason, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Brian. I'm excited to be here.
I want to go straight into it, and I want to learn more about your book, Happy Money, Happy Life. So if you wouldn't mind, before we dive into your background and your passions, can you provide like a 50,000-foot overview of what it's about so our listeners can appreciate what the conversation is going to look like?
Yeah, so Happy Money, Happy Life is a book I wanted to write for a very long time, but I was told there wasn't a market for it. And so this is a book.
Really?
Yeah.
There's not a market for people that want to be happier. Interesting. Okay. Go ahead.
Well, especially this topic of this book where I make a connection between the 8 wellness dimensions. And so this book focuses on introducing people to the concept, the multidimensional approach to health, wealth, and financial freedom. And what that means is you get a better understanding of the 8 wellness dimensions that comprise you. So that includes your mental, emotional, physical, spiritual, social, occupational, environmental, and financial well-being. And what I've done is that I show how money weaves itself into these dimensions, how it affects you negatively and positively, and how you can use money to improve your well-being. And so essentially you can buy happiness by spending on wellness. And I show you exactly what you need to do in each of these dimensions to buy happiness. And so when I talked about like there wasn't a book, a market for this book, it all had to do with when you're talking about mental and emotional health. I mean, that's a very taboo. So when I started, you can't talk about money. Well, you really can't talk about mental health or emotional health. Right. And so that's when they told me there was no market for it. And then eventually we've been through what we've been through in the past few years, and more people are open to talking about some of the stresses that they experience in life that may or may not have to do with money. And I touch upon that in this book.
I remember my first week teaching, first year, I should say. And the first time that somebody came in for a professional development session, they went back through, it wasn't new, but they reinforced the importance of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And essentially it's that students cannot learn unless their basic needs are met. Basic needs meaning they have a roof over their heads, they're not hungry during class, they feel safe. And money ultimately provides those things. And we as people, we can't be happy unless we have security first. So I'm glad that you started the way you started, because the idea that money cannot buy happiness is absurd, right? It can buy the things that at least are the foundation that allow you to live a happy life. So I had to get that out. And before we dive into those 8 pillars, can you share with our listeners a little bit more about, or a little bit about your background?
Yeah, so I am someone who has an extensive professional experience in the finance industry. So I worked in banking for 8.5 years. And I like to point this out because I am talking with a place of knowledge. So it's just not someone in the basement that just started learning about money and happiness. And so, but my story really starts, and I think it's important because you talked about students and their needs. My story, when it relates to kind of like joy and happiness and success, started when I was 17. And that's when my parents sat me down and said, we can't afford to send you to school. I was shocked because I think growing up in my household, my parents made sure our needs were met. shelter, food, and things like that. We didn't have luxury goods. We didn't go to fancy vacations. I didn't wear brand name clothing. I had hand-me-downs, but I never really thought about money in this context. And I thought everything was going to be okay. They told me, follow the plan to success. Graduate high school, go to college, get a job, buy a car, get promoted, get married, et cetera, follow this path.
Right.
And as I am going through this, I realize, I'm like, wait a minute. It's like, we don't have money and I can't go to school. And so when my friends were going to college, I found myself working at Newark Airport, cleaning toilets, serving drinks, to pay for my first year of school. And, there are moments where I think about how hard I worked in high school. I was class president. I played sports. I did community service. I did all the things that they tell me to do in order to get into college so I can get that dream job. And here I was doing the things I didn't think I would be doing. So for me, I think that has informed my relationship with money. And I'm gonna hit on this money aspect here because I think I was so tied in terms of believing that money was going to be the answer to my life questions, and it certainly was up to a point once my needs were met. And so with that said, I went to school, and I'd like people to know this, is that I went to school originally for filmmaking. And I think when you tell anyone who wants to pursue a creative profession, you're not going to make any money. And so I was talked into switching my career or my prospects from filmmaking to business and into finance, and being a bit more specific, because that's where people makes, that's where they make their money. And so here I am, kind of following that path, going into banking, starting as a teller. And I worked my way up to being VP of marketing and business development in a pretty short period of time, in 4 years. So you're looking at, here I am taking your deposits, and then all of a sudden I'm in the boardroom making strategic decisions about the direction of this credit union that I was working in. And I did so well in that job. I worked so hard that they offered me the successor CEO position before the age of 30. And so I was living my dream. I was following that corporate path and climbing up that ladder. And eventually I started asking myself, well, when do I start feeling happier? When do I start feeling more joy? And so I said, you know what? I just need to work harder. And interestingly enough, I started feeling aches and pains in my body. And so I was doing, and I was doing the mental gymnastics in my mind to say everything was okay, that I had a great job, I lived in a nice place, but then it began manifesting itself physically. So I was beginning to get these physical ailments. And so I knew something had to change. And so when I was offered the successor CEO route, I did the unthinkable. I resigned instead. And I went backpacking around the world, and I went through 20 countries in 12 months, Southeast Asia, Central America, Western Europe. That's when I was having conversations with people, and they were telling me how lucky I was to be American, to have all these opportunities. And it gave me a different set of perspectives. And then I realized, when I was sitting on top of this 8th century temple, staring at 5,000 temples, pagodas, and stupas in Myanmar, a country I never heard of, it made me ask myself, how did I get from where I was to where I am today? How did I get to a point where I was financially struggling to being financially well enough to say no to kind of like the height of professional success and more money? And that had a lot to do with access to the right resources, a better network, access to knowledge to help me make better financial decisions. And so when I came back home to the States, I wanted to empower others like me who are on this quest, or who are on this path, who want to walk the non-traditional path. How can I help them? And I knew it all boiled down to making different decisions. And in order to make different decisions, we needed to get our money right, because that was my challenge. And I know that's the challenges of many people. And that's how I started Frugal as a blog, and it's grown since. And then I decided to come up with a interesting project to go, combining my love of conversing about financial wellness and travel. And I went on a road trip across the country, and to break the taboo on money. And then I got a book deal. and I wrote a book called You Only Live Once. For us millennials, young and old, it's YOLO, right? Drinks at the
Yeah.
bar, or mindless
Yeah.
spending sprees. But I knew that YOLO meant an understanding that we only get to live once. And it's about living well today as we plan for a better tomorrow. So it's not about deprivation, it's about an active direction. And I wanted people to truly understand that we don't have to sacrifice all the things we want until later in life, until we reach a financial milestone or we reach retirement age. We can make decisions where we can bring more joy and happiness. And so that's what brings me to kind of like this conversation and to this second book, where I openly talk more about the mental, the physical, the emotional aspects of my story.
I really appreciate the fact that you decided that time was more valuable than money, and that there's no better time in your life to do what you did, to take those two adventures and have a better understanding of what life is all about. And I'm just honored that you're going to be with us today, sharing some of those lessons. So, what's the first thing that you would, let's say, first pillar from the book that you would like to share to help folks understand what one step could be for them to walk closer to happiness?
Yeah. So the first pillar is a happy mind, which is mental health. And I think mental health is something that is so important. And I'm happy that more and more people are talking about it. There are more and more resources available. And I want to preface and I want to connect this to the book and to talk about money and mental health. We understand that when we are financially stressed, that it can cause mental distress.
Yep.
And
Yep.
so when we are facing those financial challenges, we know that's causing a great deal of stress in our lives, and that affects our moods, that affects how we relate to others. And interestingly enough, science and research has shown how mental health affects financial well-being. So there's an inverse relationship. And so I think it was really important for people to understand that if you are having a mental health crisis, if you're having mental challenges, it is going to affect how you spend your money, whether or not you save or invest. And that is going to affect your financial health. And so for anyone, financial gurus to just say, follow this prescriptive advice to save more, invest more, and you'll be fine. Well, it does a disservice to those who are experiencing mental challenges. And
Right.
because the root of the issue is the mental challenge, not the financial piece of it. And so I wanted people to understand that inverse relationship between money and mental health. And once you do, and then you see the science behind it, you realize, wait a minute, uh, the stress that I'm experiencing at home or at work is causing me to cope by spending money, by buying things. That's now leading to debt, which is now creating an additional type of stress. And so I think that's really important. And what I found through my research is that to improve our mental health, it's about a growth mindset. It's about learning more. It's about challenging our way of thinking. It's about increasing our knowledge. It's increasing our awareness of things we don't even know exist. So there's this thing with Dr. Dweck. So she wrote the growth mindset. She kind of coined this term. And I think it's
Yep.
important for people to understand because the only way for us to kind of grow from scarcity or a limited belief is to really push our knowledge by gaining as much as we can. And that is as simple as listening to a podcast. So listening to this podcast can introduce people to new concepts, and that will expand their mind. And that new data input from your brain can assess your situation differently. And that's what I thought was really fascinating. So when we talk about time heals all things, well, what I've learned is that if you are learning within that time, you're giving your brain new data, new inputs that's going to process your situation differently. And so if you say, I'm not going to read a book, I'm gonna have the same conversations, and I'm gonna watch the same reality TV shows, and I'm gonna listen to the same news that get me agitated. Well, your brain can't process the situation any differently, and so you're gonna feel like you're stuck. So with Happy Minds, I encourage people to really focus on increasing their knowledge, gaining an understanding of how to better themselves. And again, it's as simple as listening to podcasts, watching YouTube channels that give you knowledge, reading books, taking workshops, taking courses. And so on the money aspect of it, right? So how can money buy happiness on the mental health dimension? It's by spending on those things. And so people tend to stay away from spending money on a course. Well, guess what? You spending money on a course that teaches you, let's say, how to better your mind, or even just learn a new skill such as painting, will help your
Hmm.
brain grow. And so that's how you can buy happiness in the mental health dimension.
When you think about a lot of the ways in which people in our country compare material wealth with one another as some sort of status symbol or an idea of what success should look like, it creates the same kind of problems, right? Where if you don't have a house as big as somebody else, that all of a sudden you feel, like a failure. And I, I go back to your first story of having the opportunity to be the CEO of a credit union at such a young age, which in most people's mindset would be the pinnacle of success, and where you recognize that each time that you were getting elevated, you weren't getting happier,
Yeah.
and that it's like you're on um, this cycle that is never going to get any better until you break the cycle with something as drastic as you did, because you understood the relationship between your mental health and happiness. I want to stress that for men right now, uh, although it's not widely reported in the media, men are really hurting.
Mhm.
The suicide rate for men is 4 times the rate as women. 4 times. Middle-aged men are and husbands are generally speaking not in a good place right now, and that needs to change. So I'm thrilled that you brought up that aspect in your book, because that should be the primary focus that all of us have in supporting each other. So anyhow, what is the second pillar that you want to point out?
And so when you mentioned that, I actually have goosebumps, because I wanted to talk about the second pillar called emotional health, and it's called happy heart. And I think this goes with men, and that we aren't taught to express the plethora of emotions that humans go through. And
Right.
it's interesting, right? Because I was at a store, and I remember I was lined up, and there's a small child, probably 4 or 5 years old, with a parent, and the child just started being emotional and started crying. I don't know for what reason. And the parent looked at the child and said, "Boys don't cry,
Yeah.
man up."
Right.
And
Right. Man up.
it
Man up. Exactly.
man up. And it
Yep.
actually triggered me, because I started thinking about just all the society, the media, and reinforcing this idea that men only have one emotion, being angry. And I don't want to
Yep.
speak for all men, but that's how I was raised, to feel like we can only express anger, because anger is when then we can fight, right? We can use anger to
Yep.
fight, and that's what men are. But we are human beings, and human beings have a plethora of emotions. We can be sad, we can be happy, we can be emotional, we could cry, we could be joyful. We don't just have to be angry. And so, what I wanted people to understand in the happy heart, the emotional wellness dimension, is to understand that we are made up of these different type of emotions, and our emotions play a big role. But I also wanted people to understand that emotions is not what makes us really us. Like, emotions is a passing feeling. It's a response to a situation and an environment. And to kind of circle back around, since an emotion is a response to a situation and environment, it means we can respond accordingly. So that can include crying because we didn't get what we wanted, and that's okay because that is a proper response to not getting something that we've worked really hard for or that we've wanted. And that is a proper human response. And if we cannot perceive those emotions, if we're not allowed to express them, if we're not allowed to show them, that does affect us, because that suppression of emotions eventually turns into a diagnosable mental health disorder. And so that mental health disorder can then lead to that depression, that anxiety, and science is backing this up. The research is showing, and that's why when people tend to say, "Oh yeah, it's important for us to express our emotions," I always say that's very true, but it's important for us to perceive our emotions and learn to manage them and learn to respond to them by understanding that we are not our emotions. Our emotions are a response to a situation and environment. And once we understand what the situation and environment is, we can be kinder to ourselves when we are responding to a specific way to a situation. And then what that does, it helps us learn. Again, it hits into that mental dimension aspect of it. And I want a little backtrack here because I want people to understand when I talk about the 8 dimensions of wellness, I want you to picture these dimensions as overlapping, intersecting. And so when you are impacting or hurting in one dimension, it ripple effects in other areas. And so when I'm talking about your emotional health, know that if you are unable to express your emotions, it will affect your mental health. And that mental health will manifest itself physically in your physical health. And so there is this connection, the mind body connection, and things like that. And so I do want to talk about that because I do follow a lot of studies when it comes to, and I like what you said, there's not a lot when it comes to men in terms of this. And I want to get a little sidetrack here because I think it's important. I read a study that showed kind of the loneliness of men. And as we get older, we become lonelier, and then we lose our friends. And it's harder for us to make friends as we get older. So once we start hitting 30, it's like we get to this mode. It's like, I have my group of friends, or
Yeah.
and and that has a lot to do with our inability to express our emotions, or the fact that if we find joy in kind of connecting with someone at over the age of 30, that it's something more than just a friendship. And I think I want people to understand it's like, we really need to reevaluate our understanding of emotions, and that is part of our wellness and part of our ability to connect with people, and that's important.
So I'm so thankful that you shared that, and the fact that all of these things do ripple through one another, right? Because if you're not well inside, eventually your behavior that people see is going to bleed through. So what is another pillar that you want to bring up that you believe is important, particularly for men to understand?
So it's physical well-being, and that's the
Mm,
physical health dimension, what I call happy body. And so I think we've talked around it, right? We talked about mental health, emotional health, and there is a mind body connection. And so all when I talked about the mental gymnastics we all do, and that's the mental gymnastics you've done, like that word man up, you're doing, kind of pushing through all the obstacles, even though something isn't working, even though you want to express a different type of emotion. And
yep.
so all that mental gymnastics wears down your mind and will manifest itself physically. And in your situation, you developed an ulcer and you're bleeding through that. And I had a similar situation where I was just kind of pushing through all the stresses I was experiencing, and I had bloodshot eyes for 2 weeks, and my eyes were bleeding for 2 weeks, and I think I popped a few blood vessels, and I kept popping them, and also I developed vertigo, and there was a moment I couldn't get out of bed, and so then I would have
Mm,
panic attacks for unknown reasons, and this is your body telling you something is wrong. And and it's important for us to once we start seeing some of the signs, which is really heavily on fatigue. The moment you start feeling tired,
Yeah.
you're falling asleep during the day, that should be a mental note to say something is happening um, in my situation, in my environment that I need to address. And most of the time, we'll say, you know what, I'm just going to drink coffee, that energy drink, I'm going to push through it. Well, that's just going to compound the issue to the point where you cannot ignore it any longer. And one thing that I shared in the book was that sometimes when it relates to money, we work so hard to earn income because we have to be quote unquote the breadwinners. We have to, whatever the old society has ingrained in us. Well, what tends to happen is that if we aren't taking care of our physical bodies, all the money that you make will be spent on prescriptions you can't pronounce and doctor
Right.
visits. And so it's so vital to understand that we need to take care of our physical health as well, because it will affect, so again, it ripples effects in all these other dimensions. And so think about it. When I gained like 15 pounds or 20 pounds at that point, and I could feel my breathing was changing. I could feel I couldn't fit well in my clothes. I couldn't move. Well, guess what? Doesn't that do something to us mentally? We see ourselves in
Yep.
the mirror. We're like, oh man, like what? I'm letting myself go. And then we trip ourselves up with the set of emotions that run through it. And so again, it's all connected. And so for me, and I think when we had a quick conversation on email, we wanted to talk about kind of the physical health and like what I learned and how I found yoga. And I think this is really funny, right? Because I grew up in Jersey and I wasn't exposed to yoga. And for me, I thought yoga was something that women do. And I
Right.
mean that was just something that I grew up with. And so when I moved out to California, my CEO on the first day, she tells me, "Hey Jason, bring a change of clothes. We're doing yoga at lunch in the main campus." And here I am going, "This is the first day. This is the boss. I'm not going to say no." And I'm like, "California? Like what is up?" And
Yeah. Right. Right.
yeah. So I did it. I brought a change of clothes and I did yoga, and it was my first introduction to it. I was like, okay, this is very difficult because I couldn't touch my knees. That's how like stiff I was already. I couldn't touch my knees. And so eventually I didn't know anyone, and I kind of forced myself to kind of meet this group of people. And eventually I found some flexibility, and I'm like, okay, it's a certain specific practice. And for me, that became the evolution of understanding, the importance of movement, flexibility, and strength. And so I think too, for us men, we see these, and I'm very open, right? I have no shame, I have no guilt, no more embarrassment. Yes, I look at pictures of other dudes and I see their ripped bodies. I see how they look in clothes. I'm like, I want to look like that. And then, but I have other priorities. And so,
Right.
so for me, it's like, okay, well, that is a full-time job. Now I understand after speaking with a lot of fitness influencers, it is a full-time job to look that good on camera or on social media. That's not the space that I'm in. I'm doing other things. So what I've learned as I've kind of dissected like their teachings and books and things like that is that we need to focus ourselves on flexibility, on movement, and on strength. And that doesn't mean lifting the most weights at the gym. That doesn't mean having 8-pack abs. It really means like, are you flex? Can you touch your toes? Can you
Right.
bend? Can you twist and turn? Can you lift your hands above your head? These are the things that we're not taught, but like, they teach it to women in Pilates classes, in yoga classes. And what I discovered is that as we age, as men age, we lose body mass. So not only are we losing bone density, we are losing muscle density, and that goes along with flexibility. So what happens? We slip and fall, then we break our hip, and that becomes a big issue. And so for me, it's like I've been an advocate of like a method I think I mentioned to you, and I wrote about it in the book called RAN. So it's the RAN method for happy body, and that is rest, activity, and nutrition. And so I think it's important for us to rest, and that is getting as much sleep as possible. And knowing your body that some days you could probably go on 4 hours of sleep, and other days you might need 6 or 8 hours. And being kind to yourself, and realizing that. And that also goes with activity. And activity isn't just like you're constantly running around. Activity is making sure that you are moving your body, you're getting up to walk, you are stretching, you are doing something physical because your body needs to move. And what one of the doctors, physical therapists that I interviewed, she says, yeah, there is a truth to lose it, like use it or lose it. If you stop moving, your body will become less flexible and it becomes more rigid. And then that's when things tends to break. And the third part of the RAND method is nutrition. And it's so vital for us to get the nutrients. So I'm okay with people eating what they eat, right? So they can eat their
Yeah.
steaks, they can eat their food, but I'm more focused on people getting the right nutrients into their body. And that means giving your cells the necessary kind of like building material to create other cells. And for me, it was a wake-up call when someone had mentioned, when you're driving a Ferrari, you don't put regular gas in the tank of a Ferrari. It's premium, very premium gas that you place in there because you don't want the engine to wear and tear after kind of using like a gas with a bit more solvents in there. And so it's the same thing with our body. Our body uses the material, the food, which is the material that it needs in order to create cells. So if we are eating food that's crap, well, it's going to make very crappy cells. And so that has changed my relationship with food. And so, yes, I love delicious food. I admit it. I love fried food. I love my French fries. I love my fried chicken. Uh, but I also understand that I need the vitamins, I need the minerals, I need these specific things to keep my body healthy. So when the cells need what it needs, it's not pulling like kind of pulling from junk food. It's pulling from food that has what it needs to build a stronger body.
We we had on in a separate podcast a professor that runs the family consumer science for the University of Georgia, and we obviously, the purpose of the podcast was to understand what men could eat that is reasonable, that we understand like what we're supposed to eat to look and feel good, but it's not that easy. And she just continued to reinforce, look, you can eat anything you want, just eat in moderation. And the things that are really unhealthy for you, just, eat smaller amounts. That's it. And she talked about essentially the importance of just drinking, like pounding water and lots of green vegetables. And she's, is essentially, if you, can do those things and have whole grains and eat bad food in moderation, you should be okay. And you brought up, this idea that, you don't have to have an 8-pack anymore, that, that you essentially need to be active. And what we have certainly seen as a result of how work has changed from COVID is that more and more of us sit even longer during the day, right?
Yeah.
It was one thing where we would, get into our car and walk to work, and at least we're walking around and talking. And now we just like literally walk 12 steps to our office. That is so bad for us. Like it's so unhealthy just to sit all day. And as an ex-subpar college athlete who probably has injuries from sitting too much on the bench, but injuries nonetheless, if I don't work out like 4 days a week and do a lot of stretching, I feel terrible. And like my hip flexors are tight, my hamstrings are tight. I have to constantly stretch them. And if I don't, my blood doesn't flow right. I don't feel right. And the bottom line is that you just need to have that routine as a part of your lifestyle, just so, as you said, you look fine in your clothes. I need to send you got to remind me by the end of the show or in an email and a follow-up, I'm going to send you one of our Dad Bod fitness shirts. And the tagline is, where we work out just enough to not need new pants. That's it.
I
Add on
love that.
fitness, work out just enough to not need new pants. And that's kind of where I am too. I want to end with what you think that our listeners need to walk away understanding. Now, before you do that, I want to plug your book, Happy Money, Happy Life. When we post our podcast, we'll post it online and obviously in our podcast section in YouTube and share it in social media. We'll make sure to link your book so people know where to buy Happy Money, Happy Life. And if you're interested in your blog, it's spelled frugal is spelled PH, right? So could you
Yes.
spell that for our listeners?
Yeah, it's PHROOGAL. It's not about us being cheap. It's about being mindful where we spend.
Ah, love it. I love it. Okay. So, what is it that you believe our listeners should walk away understanding that is easy to apply to their life? They can apply it right now. That'll make them happier people.
So I want to focus this on money. I want people to get away that money isn't everything, but money impacts most things. And by
Mm.
most things, it's getting our finances right. And there are simple ways to do that. And so I would want people to start focusing on simplifying their finances. And that is one. And I think in light of everything that's happening in the world today, in light of everything that's happening in the financial news that's being shared, I want everyone to go out there and start that emergency fund. If you don't have that
Mm,
emergency fund, I am begging and imploring you to have it, because emergencies happen. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when they happen. And
right.
sometimes they are within your control, and sometimes they're not in your control, as such as a bank collapsing. So I think it's important for people to understand that. And the statistics are still out that you're looking at over 60% of people do not have more than $400
Yeah.
saved to cover an emergency. And so that is a great deal of stress, and that stress is going to affect your mental, your physical. So I think that's one of the things that I encourage people to have. And the one thing though that I'm a big proponent of, because I'm all about living happy lives, is helping you buy back your time. So that is starting what I call a freedom fund. I want you to start storing money into an account that can buy back a month, up to 12. And so to give yourself a moment of pause in your career, in your life, to do something that makes you happy, to explore an interest, to find a new curiosity that you haven't yet discovered. And so this freedom fund, again, just covers your basic living expenses. So if your basic living expenses is $2,000 a month, you need to have $24,000 in this freedom fund in order to buy back a year of your time. And the reason why this is like the takeaway I want people to have is that my sabbatical year was funded with a freedom fund, but I didn't call it that. It was my mortgage, kind of like my home deposit, like down payment fund
Mhm.
that was used as a freedom fund. And that changed the trajectory of my life. Having new conversations, exploring my curiosities, allowed me to expand my mind, allowed me to create and build a new network that has helped me on this path of more joy and happiness. And if we are living the life that we're living and we can't break away from it, it's so difficult for us to see the potential opportunities that are all around us, because we're still tied to this one particular path. And I also want people to leave people off with this idea that buying experiences is going to be the answer to your quest for happiness. That's true up to a point, but what you actually want is the opportunity to create memories. I think when you're buying experiences and you're buying stuff, they're the exact same thing. It becomes something that we just check off. And so what we really want is to create memories. And the way for us to create memories is by actually being present. And that means, we're not just buying that experience at that expensive restaurant. We're actually enjoying our time. And that time is creating memories with the people that we're spending it with, our spouse, our partners. And so I think that is so essential and so vital, and something that I've learned as well, that I say this often now too, is that I want people to own their time so they can create more memories, because memories appreciate over time as opposed to stuff that depreciates. And again, that it all relates to that time piece of it.
Well said. And there's no better way to end the podcast than that. Jason, really appreciate your time today. I'm sure our listeners loved every second.
Thank you so much. This was awesome, Ryan.
Thanks for joining us today. Don't forget to click subscribe wherever you download your podcasts, and share the Modern Husbands podcast with your friends. A special thanks to our guest, and of course to all of our listeners. Please be on the lookout for new and exciting announcements on modernhusbands.com. Until next time, be well.